One of the first and most dangerous signs that a narcissistic person is moving from manipulation into psychological warfare is the smear campaign. And what makes this so powerful is that it rarely looks like an attack when it begins. It often looks like concern. It sounds like a private conversation. It may even arrive disguised as sympathy. They might say, "I'm only telling you because I care about you," or "I don't want to get involved, but you should know what they've been saying." And suddenly, information begins moving from one person to another with the narcissist, carefully positioning themselves as the reasonable one and you as the problem. This is not simply gossip. Gossip is often careless and impulsive. A calculated smear campaign is different. It is a strategy for controlling perception. Think about what happens psychologically when someone attacks you directly. You can see the attack. You can respond to it. You can defend yourself. But when someone attacks your reputation indirectly, the battlefield becomes invisible. You don't know who has heard what. You don't know what version of the story exists in other people's minds. And because you cannot correct a conversation you were never present for, you can begin feeling powerless. That uncertainty is part of the psychological impact. The narcissistic individual may take a real event, remove the context, exaggerate one detail, and attach an interpretation that makes you appear selfish, unstable, cruel, arrogant, or untrustworthy. The remarkable part is that they don't necessarily need to invent everything. A distorted truth can be more persuasive than an obvious lie. Maybe you became distant because you were protecting your peace. The story becomes they abandoned everyone. Maybe you established a boundary after being repeatedly disrespected. The story becomes they think they're better than everyone. Maybe you stopped responding to manipulation. The story becomes they're mentally unstable. Notice the pattern. Your attempt to protect yourself is reframed as evidence against you. And this is where you have to understand something fundamental about human psychology. People don't respond only to facts. They respond to narratives. We naturally organize complicated social information into stories because stories make uncertainty easier to tolerate. If someone repeatedly presents themselves as the victim and you as the aggressor, some people may accept that narrative before they ever investigate the facts. This is why trying to defend yourself against every accusation can become a trap. You start explaining. Then you explain the explanation. Then you try to convince everyone that the other person is lying. And eventually, your entire life becomes a courtroom where you're constantly attempting to prove your innocence. That's exactly where you don't want to live. Your objective is not to win every person's approval. Your objective is to remain anchored in reality. There is an important philosophical distinction here. Reputation is what other people think about you. Character is what you consistently know yourself to be through your actions. A narcissistic person may attempt to destroy your reputation, but they cannot permanently destroy your character unless you allow their narrative to become your identity. And that's the deeper danger. The smear campaign isn't only designed to turn other people against you. It can eventually make you turn against yourself. You begin asking, maybe I really am the problem. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I should have handled everything differently. You start reviewing conversations from months ago, searching for evidence that you somehow caused the entire situation. This is where psychological manipulation becomes internalized. The person no longer needs to be in the room because their voice has moved into your head, but awareness interrupts that process. When you recognize a smear campaign, don't immediately react emotionally. Step back, look for patterns. Ask yourself, who benefits from this story? Is the information specific, verifiable, and consistent? Are people being encouraged to judge me without hearing my side? Has this person repeatedly positioned themselves as the victim while portraying everyone who challenges them as the enemy? Those questions move you from emotional reaction to psychological observation, and observation is power. You also have to accept something uncomfortable. Not everyone will believe you. Some people will choose the easier story. Some will believe the person who speaks first. Some may remain loyal to the narcissist because accepting the truth would force them to reconsider their own relationship with that person. Let them. You don't need to chase every person who walks away because of a false story. Sometimes the strongest response to a smear campaign is consistency over time. Continue behaving with integrity. Continue treating people fairly. Continue building your life. Reality has something manipulation does not have: durability. A fabricated story requires maintenance. Truth usually requires consistency. So if you notice the sudden rumors, the strange changes in people's behavior, the unexplained hostility, or the appearance of stories about you that seem strangely coordinated, don't immediately panic. Pay attention, because sometimes the moment you stop allowing someone to control you is the moment they begin trying to control how everyone else sees you. And when that happens, don't become obsessed with proving who you are. Become more committed to living it. Protect your reality, protect your character, and never surrender your identity to someone else's narrative. The second sign is more subtle, but in many ways it can be even more damaging. They begin targeting your confidence and your sense of identity. And understand what makes this different from ordinary criticism. Healthy criticism is connected to a specific behavior. Someone might say, "That decision wasn't effective," or "You could have handled that conversation differently." The criticism has boundaries. It addresses something you did. Psychological manipulation attacks something much deeper. It starts making you question who you are. You may hear things like, "You're too sensitive. Nobody else has a problem with me. You're impossible to deal with. You're always overreacting. You're not as intelligent as you think you are." At first, these statements can seem like isolated insults, but repeated over time, they begin to create something much more powerful: an internal narrative. And this is where the psychology becomes important. Human beings develop a sense of self partly through feedback. We don't form our identity in complete isolation. We observe how others respond to us, how relationships unfold, and how our behavior affects the world. When someone repeatedly attacks that feedback system, they can create confusion about your own perception. You start asking, "Am I actually too sensitive? Am I really the difficult one? Maybe I can't trust my judgment." That is the transition from criticism to psychological control. Because once you stop trusting your own perception, you become dependent on someone else's interpretation of reality. And that's an extremely vulnerable position. Imagine having a compass that you suddenly don't trust. You can still walk, but you have no confidence about the direction. That's what chronic psychological invalidation can do. It doesn't necessarily destroy your intelligence. It undermines your confidence in using it. The narcissistic individual may exploit this through something commonly described as gaslighting. Gaslighting isn't simply someone disagreeing with you. People can remember events differently. People can make mistakes. The problem arises when someone repeatedly denies, distorts, or reinterprets reality in a way that causes you to distrust your own memory and judgment. You remember what happened. They tell you it never happened. You remember what they said. They tell you that you misunderstood. You react to something hurtful. They focus entirely on your reaction and ignore what caused it. Over time, you can become more focused on defending your perception than evaluating the original behavior. And notice how powerful that reversal is. The conversation stops being about what happened and becomes about whether you're allowed to believe that it happened. This is why protecting your identity becomes essential. You have to separate your behavior from your worth. Maybe you made a mistake. That doesn't mean you're a failure. Maybe you handled a conversation badly. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. Maybe you trusted someone who manipulated you. That doesn't mean you're foolish. One of the easiest ways for another person to control you is to convince you that one mistake reveals your entire identity. But human beings are more complex than that. You are not one argument. You are not one relationship. You are not one person's opinion of you. And when you understand that, manipulation loses some of its power. The philosophical question underneath all of this is profound. Who gets to define you? If you give that authority entirely to another person, then your emotional stability becomes dependent on their approval. When they praise you, you feel valuable. When they criticize you, you collapse. When they withdraw affection, you panic. When they return, you feel relief. That isn't freedom. That's psychological dependence. And the solution isn't becoming arrogant or refusing all criticism. Quite the opposite. Real psychological strength means becoming capable of examining criticism without automatically accepting it and without automatically rejecting it. Ask, is this specific? Is it consistent with observable facts? Is this person trying to help me improve, or are they trying to make me smaller? Do people I trust independently observe the same pattern? Does this feedback challenge my behavior, or does it attack my entire identity? Those questions restore something incredibly important: discernment. Because confidence isn't the belief that you're always right. Confidence is knowing that you can examine yourself honestly without allowing someone else to define you. And this is where many people misunderstand boundaries. A boundary isn't an attempt to control another person's behavior. It's a decision about what you will participate in. You don't need permission to step away from conversations that consistently degrade you. You don't need to prove that your boundary is reasonable to someone committed to violating it. Sometimes the most powerful sentence you can say is simply, "I know what I experienced, and I don't need to argue about my reality." That doesn't mean refusing accountability. It means refusing psychological captivity. Because once someone realizes they can make you doubt yourself, they don't have to control your environment. They only have to control your interpretation of yourself. So protect that inner voice. Listen to trustworthy feedback. Examine your mistakes. Take responsibility when you're wrong. But never confuse humility with self-erasure. The moment you stop letting someone else define your worth, their ability to control you begins to disappear. The third sign is when a narcissistic person begins collecting your vulnerabilities and eventually turning them into weapons. And this is one of the reasons you have to be extremely careful about who you give access to your deepest fears, insecurities, regrets, and private experiences. Because information creates power in relationships. When someone genuinely cares about you, the vulnerable things you share become something they protect. Your fears aren't ammunition, your mistakes aren't leverage, your private experiences aren't entertainment for other people. But a manipulative person may treat vulnerability differently. At the beginning, they may actually encourage you to open up. They ask unusually personal questions. They want to know what hurts you, what you've experienced, what you're afraid of, what happened in your previous relationships, what makes you insecure, and what you secretly believe about yourself. And because this can feel like intimacy, you may interpret their curiosity as emotional depth. But curiosity and care are not the same thing. Someone can know everything about you and still have no intention of protecting you. This is why one of the most important psychological principles in relationships is that trust should be earned progressively. You don't have to reveal your entire psychological history simply because someone appears interested in you. Intimacy should be built through consistency, not accelerated through emotional disclosure. Watch what happens after you reveal something vulnerable. Do they become more compassionate? Do they respect the information? Do they protect your privacy even when they're angry? Or do they eventually bring it back during an argument? Because that moment tells you something. Imagine telling someone that you struggle with abandonment, and months later, during conflict, they deliberately threaten to leave just to make you panic. Imagine telling someone that you have a particular insecurity, and later they use that exact insecurity to humiliate you. Imagine trusting someone with a private story from your past, only to discover that they have repeated it to other people. That's not ordinary conflict. That's the weaponization of vulnerability. And psychologically, it works because the attack comes from inside the walls you allowed them to enter. A stranger insulting you may hurt, but someone using your deepest confession against you can feel like betrayal at the level of identity. You don't just think, they insulted me. You think, I trusted this person with the part of me that I don't show everyone, and they used it against me. That creates a very specific kind of psychological injury. It can make you want to close yourself off completely, and that's another trap. You shouldn't respond to one person's misuse of your trust by deciding that nobody deserves trust. The lesson isn't to become emotionally unavailable. The lesson is to become discerning. There is a difference between openness and indiscriminate access. Not everyone deserves the same level of information about you. Think about your personal life as having layers. Acquaintances might know basic information. Friends may know more. Trusted people gradually gain access to deeper parts of your experience. That progression isn't cold or paranoid. It's psychologically healthy. Trust should have evidence behind it. Look for consistency between words and actions. Watch how someone treats information that belongs to other people. If they constantly expose other people's secrets to you, understand that eventually you may become the next subject of conversation. That's an overlooked warning sign. If someone repeatedly tells you confidential stories about everyone they know, don't automatically feel special because they're telling you yours. Ask yourself why they need to turn private information into social currency. People reveal their character not only through what they do with your vulnerability, but through what they do with everyone else's. And there's another layer here. A narcissistic person may use your vulnerabilities to create a distorted identity for you. They may tell you you're insecure, you're jealous, you're afraid of being alone, you can't handle rejection. Then they deliberately create situations that activate those vulnerabilities. Now you're reacting emotionally, and they point to your reaction as proof that their description of you was correct. That's a psychological loop. They provoke the wound, then criticize you for bleeding. This is why self-awareness becomes such a powerful defense. If you know your vulnerabilities, they become areas for growth rather than buttons that someone else can control. You can say, yes, abandonment is something that affects me, but that doesn't mean someone gets to manipulate me with the threat of leaving. You can acknowledge your insecurity without surrendering your dignity. You can admit your mistakes without giving someone permission to repeatedly punish you for them. And you can be compassionate toward the parts of yourself that are still healing. The goal isn't to become impossible to hurt. That's unrealistic. The goal is to become difficult to control through your pain, because your wounds do not have to become weaknesses. They can become sources of wisdom. So be careful about the person who seems fascinated by your deepest vulnerabilities but becomes cruel when you stop giving them what they want. Pay attention to whether your private disclosures create safety or eventually become ammunition. Trust slowly, observe carefully, and remember that emotional intimacy is not measured by how much you reveal. It is measured by how safely what you reveal is held. Your vulnerability is sacred information. Give access to it only to people whose character has earned the right to hold it. The fourth sign is isolation. And this is where manipulation can become much more powerful, because a person who wants control understands something fundamental about human psychology. People are easier to influence when they are cut off from independent sources of perspective, support, and reality. Isolation doesn't always begin with, stop talking to your friends. It's usually much more subtle. They may criticize the people closest to you. They may say, your friends don't really understand you, or your family is jealous of you, or I'm the only person who actually knows the real you. At first, that can sound like loyalty, but listen carefully to the underlying message. Everyone else is becoming the enemy, and this person is positioning themselves as your only safe place. That's a dangerous psychological shift. Healthy relationships expand your world. Manipulative relationships gradually shrink it. You may notice that every time you spend time with someone else, conflict follows. If you visit your family, they become angry. If you spend time with friends, they accuse you of neglecting them. If someone gives you advice that contradicts their narrative, suddenly that person is toxic, fake, or against us. Eventually, you may start avoiding people simply because you don't want another argument, and that's how isolation works. The manipulator doesn't always have to physically prevent you from seeing people. They can make maintaining those relationships emotionally exhausting until you voluntarily withdraw. This is an important distinction. Control doesn't always look like a command. Sometimes it looks like conditioning. You learn that certain friendships produce conflict, so you stop mentioning them. You learn that certain family members trigger accusations, so you stop visiting them. You learn that independent opinions create tension, so eventually you stop asking anyone for advice. And now something significant has happened. Your world has become smaller. When your support network becomes smaller, the manipulator's influence becomes larger. Think about what happens when you're facing a difficult situation and you have 5 trustworthy people who can give you different perspectives. One person may say, I think you're being treated unfairly. Another may say, maybe you misunderstood the situation. A third may say, I've noticed this pattern before. That diversity of perspective protects your judgment. But if you only have one person's interpretation of reality, their version begins to feel like reality itself. This is why isolation is psychologically dangerous. Human beings are social creatures. We calibrate our perceptions through interaction with others. When that feedback disappears, uncertainty grows. And when uncertainty grows, people often become more dependent on whoever appears most confident. A manipulative person can exploit that. They may create a false sense of exclusivity. Nobody understands you like I do. Everyone else will disappoint you. You can't trust anyone. It's us against the world. There is something emotionally seductive about that message, especially if you've already been hurt by other people. But real intimacy doesn't require destroying your other relationships. A healthy partner, friend, or family member can say, "I want you to have people in your life besides me." A controlling person may think, "I want to be the person you have instead of everyone else." Those are radically different psychological positions. And here's another warning sign. They may attempt to recruit allies. This is where the earlier smear campaign connects directly to isolation. They damage your reputation, then use the resulting tension as evidence that people don't like you. They may tell someone, "See, even they don't want to deal with you." Or they create conflict between you and another person, then step in as the only person willing to comfort you. The sequence becomes manipulation disguised as rescue. They help create the problem and then position themselves as the solution. This is why you have to maintain relationships outside any emotionally intense connection. Keep contact with people who knew you before the conflict. Stay connected to friends who are capable of disagreeing with you. Maintain relationships with people who don't need anything from you. Because independent relationships provide independent reality checks. And if someone becomes angry simply because another person has influence in your life, pay attention. Jealousy can happen in ordinary relationships, but persistent attempts to control who you see, what you discuss, and whose advice you trust are serious warning signs. You don't need to prove that someone is a narcissist before protecting your boundaries. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need to win an argument. You simply need to recognize behavior that consistently undermines your autonomy. And remember something important. Boundaries are not walls. A wall says, "Nobody gets in." A boundary says, "You can come close, but you don't get to control me." That's psychological independence. If you've already become isolated, don't feel ashamed. Manipulation often works gradually. Rebuilding your support system can also happen gradually. Reach out to one trustworthy person. Reconnect with someone you've lost contact with. Seek perspectives outside the relationship. Give yourself permission to hear opinions that don't perfectly match your own. Because freedom begins when you have more than one source of reality. The goal isn't to live suspicious of everyone. It's to remain connected enough that no single person's narrative can become your entire world. Never surrender your entire social world to one person's control. Isolation creates dependence, but connection restores perspective. The fifth sign is when their need for revenge becomes an obsession. And this is where you need to stop interpreting their behavior through the ordinary logic of conflict. Most emotionally healthy people can experience anger, disappointment, rejection, or even humiliation and eventually process those emotions. They may need time, they may become distant, they may express their frustration, but eventually the situation loses its emotional charge. A person driven by narcissistic patterns may respond very differently when they feel rejected, exposed, ignored, or deprived of control. What hurts them isn't always the event itself. Sometimes it's what the event represents. You said no, you established a boundary, you stopped chasing them, you refused to apologize for something you didn't do, you exposed a contradiction, you walked away. To a psychologically healthy person, these things may be uncomfortable. To someone whose identity depends heavily on control, admiration, or superiority, they can feel like an attack on the self. This is sometimes described as narcissistic injury, a profound reaction to a perceived threat to a person's inflated or fragile sense of self. And once that injury occurs, the objective can change. It is no longer about solving the disagreement. It becomes about restoring superiority. This is why you have to pay attention to escalation. A normal disagreement has an endpoint. A revenge-oriented pattern keeps finding new reasons to continue. The argument happened 3 months ago, but they're still bringing it up. You apologize, but it wasn't enough. You tried to move forward, but they keep reopening the conflict. You stopped engaging, and suddenly new accusations appear. You succeeded at something, and they seem unusually determined to undermine it. The issue is no longer the issue. The issue is that they cannot psychologically tolerate losing control of the narrative. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They think, if I just explain myself better, they'll finally understand. Maybe, but sometimes understanding is not the objective. Control is. You could provide 10 explanations and they could create an 11th accusation. You could answer every message and another message appears. You could prove one lie false and suddenly 3 new claims replace it. This creates what feels like an endless courtroom. And if you enter that courtroom every time, you become trapped inside someone else's emotional agenda. The healthier response is to recognize when resolution has stopped being the goal. Look at behavior rather than promises. Someone may say, I'm only trying to get closure while continuing to provoke conflict. Someone may claim, I just want the truth to come out, while repeatedly spreading information designed to damage you. Don't focus only on the language. Study the pattern. What happens after you establish a boundary? What happens when you stop reacting? What happens when you succeed? What happens when other people praise you? What happens when you refuse to give them emotional access? These moments can reveal far more than a person's words. Because revenge isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like sabotage. Sometimes it's withholding important information. Sometimes it's deliberately creating confusion. Sometimes it's trying to damage your reputation. Sometimes it's provoking you until you finally react. Then using your reaction as evidence that you are the unstable one. That last pattern is particularly important. If someone repeatedly pushes you toward an emotional breaking point and then points at your emotional response as proof that you're the problem, recognize the trap. They create the conditions. You provide the reaction. Then they use the reaction to rewrite the story. The answer is not to become emotionless. The answer is to become less predictable under provocation. Pause. Don't answer immediately. Don't send the message you will regret tomorrow. Don't make permanent decisions while you're flooded with anger. And don't allow someone else's emotional chaos to dictate your behavior. There is enormous psychological power in refusing to participate in a conflict that exists primarily to control you. That doesn't mean tolerating abuse or ignoring legitimate threats. If behavior becomes threatening, coercive, or dangerous, prioritize your safety, document relevant incidents where appropriate, and seek qualified local support. But psychologically, understand this: you don't have to attend every battle you're invited to. Some battles are designed to consume your attention. Some arguments exist only to keep you emotionally connected to the person you're trying to escape. And sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to a manipulative person is not revenge. It's irrelevance. Not because you're trying to punish them, but because you've stopped allowing their behavior to determine your emotional state. That's freedom. You don't need them to admit what they did. You don't need them to understand your perspective. You don't need them to agree that you were mistreated. You need to become clear about what you will and will not participate in. And this brings us back to a deeper philosophical principle. Your attention is part of your life. Every hour spent obsessing over someone's manipulation is an hour removed from your own future. Every conversation spent defending yourself is energy that could have been invested in rebuilding. Every attempt to make a determined manipulator understand you can become another chain tying you to them. So recognize the moment when conflict becomes fixation. Recognize when disagreement becomes punishment. Recognize when someone seems less interested in resolution than in making you suffer for becoming independent, and then choose your response deliberately. The strongest revenge is not retaliation. It is becoming so psychologically free that their need to control you no longer determines the direction of your life.